My beloved child. Something is happening right now that your soulmate never planned to reveal this way. Somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of the night, they've been staring at your name on their phone, their finger hovering over the screen, their heart racing with everything they've been trying to keep hidden. They've opened your conversation more than once. They've started typing, stopped, erased the words, and started again. But this time feels different. There's an urgency inside them that they can't ignore anymore. They don't want another day to pass with this distance between you. They don't want another night wondering whether you still think about them, whether you've moved on, or whether there's still a place for them in your heart. And the strangest part is, they know exactly what they need to tell you. They're just terrified of what your answer might be. For a long time, they convinced themselves that silence was safer. Maybe they told themselves they needed space. Maybe they acted like they were perfectly fine without you, even when certain songs suddenly reminded them of your voice, certain places brought back your face, or a simple moment in the day made them wonder what you were doing. They remembered the little things you probably thought they had forgotten. The way you looked at them when you thought they weren't paying attention, the conversations that lasted longer than either of you expected, and that one moment when everything between you felt strangely effortless. But then came the misunderstanding, the hesitation, the distance. Neither of you said what you truly felt when it mattered most. And now, as they sit alone with their thoughts, they're realizing something painful. Pretending not to care never made the connection disappear. It only made the longing harder to hide. But tonight, something happened that pushed them past the point of staying silent. They came across something connected to you, something small at first, almost meaningless, and suddenly an entire flood of memories came rushing back. They remembered what they lost, what they never said, and the possibility that they might actually lose their chance forever. That's when they reached for their phone again. This time, they didn't want to send a casual, "Hey." They wanted to tell you why they disappeared, what they've been feeling, and why they suddenly need to talk to you right now. But there's one thing they discovered before sending that message, something about your life, your feelings, or your silence that completely changed what they were about to say. And when you find out what they saw, you'll understand why this message became so urgent. The moment they discovered that detail, they froze. It wasn't necessarily something dramatic on the surface. It could have been a change in your behavior, a quiet absence, something you posted, something they heard from another person, or simply the realization that you had stopped waiting for them. But to them, it felt enormous. For the first time, they understood that your silence might not mean you didn't care. It might mean you were protecting your heart. And that thought hit them harder than they expected. They began replaying every conversation between you, searching for the exact moment when things started falling apart. They remembered the times you gave them an opening to speak, only for them to pull back because fear got in the way. They remembered how many chances they had to tell you the truth. And suddenly, one question became impossible to escape: what if they wait too long and you finally close the door? That question followed them everywhere. They tried distracting themselves, but even ordinary moments became reminders of you. They would hear a familiar song and remember the way you used to talk. They would see something you once loved and instinctively reach for their phone before stopping themselves. At night, when everything became quiet, the truth became even harder to avoid. They missed the version of themselves that existed around you. The person who could laugh freely, speak without overthinking, and feel understood without explaining every little thing. And somewhere in that realization, they finally admitted something they had been fighting for a long time: they never truly wanted to move on. They wanted to move closer. But there was still one fear standing between them and that decision. What if they finally opened their heart and discovered that you no longer felt the same? So they wrote a message, stared at it for several seconds, and almost deleted it. Then they remembered something you once told them, and everything changed. That memory gave them enough courage to keep going. They opened the conversation again, their hands almost trembling as they typed. This wasn't going to be another vague message or another attempt to test your reaction. They wanted to talk about what happened between you. They wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted honesty. They wanted to tell you that the distance didn't erase their feelings, it exposed them. They wanted to explain why they pulled away when they actually wanted to come closer. And then, just before they pressed send, they noticed something that made their heart stop for a second. Your name was still there, waiting on the screen, but the message they had written wasn't the real message. There was something much deeper they had been afraid to say. Something they had never dared to put into words. And now, with one decision left to make, your soulmate was finally ready to reveal it, but what they typed next could completely change the way you understand everything that happened between you. The message sat there on the screen, unfinished. They read it once. Then again. And suddenly, all the confidence they had built disappeared. Because the words weren't casual anymore. They weren't about checking in or asking how you were doing. They were about the truth they had been carrying quietly for far too long. They wanted to tell you, I never stopped caring. They wanted to admit that the distance hurt more than they ever showed. They wanted to explain that every time they acted cold, there was usually something much softer happening underneath: fear, confusion, pride, or the belief that maybe you deserved someone who could give you certainty instead of mixed signals. But admitting that meant admitting they had made mistakes. And that was the part they struggled with most. They had spent so long protecting their pride that they almost forgot what they were protecting it from. Losing you. That thought finally broke through their defenses, and for the first time, they realized silence was no longer protecting either of you. So they did something unexpected. Instead of sending the carefully edited message, they began writing exactly what they felt. No rehearsed words. No pretending. No attempt to sound unaffected. They told you they missed the conversations they used to take for granted. They admitted that there were moments when they wanted to reach out but convinced themselves they should wait. They confessed that sometimes they would wonder whether you were thinking about them at the exact same moment. And then came the sentence they had struggled to write: I need to talk to you. Not because they wanted attention. Not because they were lonely for one night. They needed to talk because something inside them had shifted. They could no longer pretend that the connection meant nothing. They could no longer carry the unanswered questions alone. But just as they were about to send it, another memory appeared in their mind, one particular moment between you that they had never understood until now. It was a moment that seemed ordinary when it happened. Maybe it was a look that lasted a second too long. Maybe it was something you said without realizing how deeply it affected them. Maybe it was the way you stayed when they expected you to walk away. Whatever it was, they suddenly understood its meaning. You had been showing them your heart in ways they were too afraid to recognize. And now they wondered whether you had already given up because they failed to respond when it mattered. Their finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. If they sent the message, everything could change. If they deleted it, the same silence could continue for months. They took one deep breath, and finally pressed send. But they had no idea that your reaction to those words would reveal something neither of you had expected, and that is where this story takes its most emotional turn yet. The message was finally gone. For several seconds, they simply stared at the screen, almost expecting it to disappear. Their heart was beating faster than it had in a long time. They had just done the one thing they kept promising themselves they wouldn't do. They had made themselves vulnerable. There was no taking it back now. They couldn't rewrite the words or pretend they hadn't meant them. And then came the hardest part, waiting. 1 minute passed. Then another. Every time the screen lit up, their heart jumped, only to sink again when it wasn't you. They wondered whether they had said too much. Whether they should have waited. Whether you would understand what they were really trying to say. But beneath all that fear was something strangely peaceful. For once, they weren't hiding. They had finally given the truth a chance to reach you. And then, suddenly, your name appeared on their screen. They opened your response with shaking hands. But what they saw wasn't the simple answer they had imagined. Your words carried emotion too. You hadn't forgotten. You hadn't erased the memories. In fact, you had been carrying questions of your own. You wanted to know why they disappeared when things became serious. Why they pulled away after moments that felt so real. Why they acted like the connection meant nothing when their actions often said the complete opposite. Reading those words forced them to confront something uncomfortable. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. And that realization changed the entire conversation. Suddenly, the old excuses felt meaningless. They didn't want to defend themselves anymore. They wanted you to finally understand what had been happening inside them. So they started typing again, slower this time, carefully choosing every word. Then they reached the sentence they had been avoiding since the very beginning. They wrote that the truth was, they had been scared of how deeply they felt for you. Not scared of you, scared of what loving you could change. Because when someone matters this much, losing them becomes terrifying. They admitted that they had tried to convince themselves they could walk away, but every attempt only made them realize how attached their heart had become. Then came the words that made everything suddenly feel real. I don't want to keep doing this without you. They stopped after sending it, staring at the screen as if those few words had exposed their entire heart. But before you could answer, they received something else, something they absolutely did not expect. It wasn't from you. It was information about something that had happened during the time you were apart, and once they saw it, their expression completely changed. Because suddenly, they understood why your paths had been separated in the first place, and the truth was far more emotional than either of you had imagined. The information they received changed the atmosphere instantly. A moment earlier, they were focused entirely on you, waiting for your response. Now they were staring at something that connected the past to the present in a way they had never seen before. Someone had mentioned a conversation, a decision, or a misunderstanding from the time you two were separated. And suddenly, pieces that never made sense began falling into place. They realized that something they believed about you might have been completely wrong. Maybe they thought you had stopped caring. Maybe they believed you had chosen someone else. Maybe they assumed your silence meant rejection. But now they were beginning to understand that you may have been waiting too, quietly hurting, quietly wondering why they never came forward. The realization hit hard. They thought about every night they spent missing you while believing you didn't miss them. Two people could have been feeling the same thing while standing on opposite sides of the same misunderstanding. For several minutes, they couldn't type anything. They simply sat there, remembering how differently everything might have turned out if one honest conversation had happened at the right moment. They remembered the day you became distant. They remembered the look in your eyes. They remembered wanting to ask what was wrong but deciding to stay silent because they were afraid of hearing an answer they couldn't handle. Now they understood that their silence had become part of the problem. They had been waiting for a perfect moment to speak, while you may have been waiting for any sign that they still cared. And that thought broke something open inside them. They didn't want another carefully timed message. They didn't want another conversation through half-finished texts. They wanted to hear your voice. They wanted to know what you really felt. More importantly, they wanted you to hear what they had never been brave enough to say when you were standing right in front of them. Then your soulmate did something that surprised even them. They stopped typing and called you. No warning. No rehearsed message. Just one decision fueled by months of emotion. The phone rang, and for a moment, they almost hung up. Their breathing became shallow as they imagined all the possibilities. What if you didn't answer? What if you did? What if hearing your voice brought back everything they had tried to bury? Then the call connected. There was silence on both sides. Neither of you spoke immediately. But somehow, that silence said more than 100 messages could have said. They could hear your breathing. You could hear theirs. And finally, with a trembling voice, they said the words that had been waiting behind every unanswered message, "I've been trying to find the courage to tell you something." But before they could finish the sentence, something in your response made them realize this conversation was about to become much bigger than either of you expected. For a few seconds, neither of you said anything. Your soulmate could hear the emotion in your breathing, and suddenly all the words they had practiced disappeared. They had imagined this conversation so many times, but nothing prepared them for actually hearing your voice again. Then you finally spoke. Your voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It carried something much more powerful, relief. You told them that there had been moments when you wanted to call too, moments when you almost reached out, but something always stopped you. Pride. Fear. Confusion. Maybe even the belief that they no longer wanted you in their life. Hearing that made their hearts sink because they realized how much pain had been created simply because neither of you knew what the other was truly feeling. They whispered that they were sorry. Not the kind of apology people give just to end an argument, but the kind that comes after finally understanding the damage caused by silence. Then they told you why this conversation had become so urgent. They said they had reached a point where pretending was becoming harder than telling the truth. Every day they tried to move forward, some memory pulled them back. Every time they thought they were finally okay, something reminded them of you. They admitted that they had been carrying an unfinished conversation in their heart for far too long. And then they said something that made the entire tone of the call change. I don't want us to keep wondering what could have happened. They weren't asking you to forget the past. They weren't demanding an immediate answer. They were asking for one honest chance to finally speak without fear. They wanted to tell you everything they had hidden behind distance, silence, and hesitation. And as you listened, you could feel that this wasn't the same person who had walked away before. Something had changed in them. But there was still one confession they hadn't made. The words were sitting right behind their lips, and they were terrified that saying them would change everything. They took a deep breath and began explaining what they had realized during the time apart. They told you that losing your presence had taught them the difference between missing someone and genuinely valuing them. They had missed your conversations, your energy, your little habits, but more than that, they had missed the feeling of being understood by someone who never needed them to pretend. Then their voice became quieter. They said, "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." You waited. They hesitated. And then they finally revealed that the real reason they pulled away wasn't because their feelings disappeared. It was because their feelings had become stronger than they knew how to handle. But that wasn't the only secret they had been carrying. There was one final truth connected to the night everything between you changed, and when you hear what happened that night, you may finally understand why they are asking you to open this message right now. The truth finally came out. That night, when everything between you seemed to change, they hadn't stopped caring. They had actually been fighting an internal battle they never knew how to explain. They were overwhelmed by how deeply they felt about you, and instead of moving closer, they convinced themselves that stepping away would protect both of you. They thought distance would make the emotions quieter. It didn't. It made them louder. Every unanswered question became heavier. Every memory became sharper. And eventually, they realized something they could no longer deny: you weren't simply someone they had feelings for. You had become someone whose absence changed the way they experienced everything else. That was why this message had suddenly become so urgent. They weren't reaching out because they were bored or lonely. They were reaching out because they finally understood what they had almost lost. Then came the confession you had been waiting for. Their voice became quiet as they said they still wanted a future where you were part of their life. They couldn't promise that everything would suddenly become perfect, but they could promise something more important: they were ready to stop hiding. No more pretending not to care. No more disappearing whenever emotions became overwhelming. No more expecting you to read between the lines. They wanted to talk openly, face the difficult questions, and finally give this connection the honesty it deserved. They admitted that they had imagined seeing you again more times than they could count. They imagined the first moment your eyes met, the silence afterward, and the possibility that neither of you would need to explain what you were feeling. Then they asked the question that changed the entire conversation: if I came to you honestly this time, would you still give me a chance? And suddenly, the silence returned. But this silence felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. Your soulmate was waiting for your answer, knowing that whatever you said next could determine where this story goes from here. They had finally opened the door they had kept locked for so long. They had told you why they disappeared, why they stayed silent, why they kept coming back to your memory, and why they needed to talk to you now. But there was still